Good day to you, my dear students. Once again, I'm Sean Sibriel Plita for the next topic on Rizal course, which is the emerging nationalism. So, at the end of this chapter, students should be able to examine the cause and effect, or the causes and effects of the Cavite Mutiny, and to explain the conflict between the Filipino secular priests and the Spanish regular priests. Vocabulary. So when we say episcopal visitation, it is an official pastoral visit conducted by the bishop on a diocese to examine the conditions of a congregation, often done once every 3 years. Garrote is an apparatus used for capital punishment in which an iron collar is tightened around the condemned person's neck. Polo y servicio refers to a system of forced labor that requires Filipino males from 16 to 60 years old to render service for a period of 40 days. Regular clergy, these are the priests who belong to a religious orders, or those priests belong to a certain religious congregation. Secular clergy refers to the priests who did not belong to religious orders and are engaged in pastoral work, often called as diocesan priests. Tributo is a system of taxation imposed by Spanish colonial government on the Filipinos in order to generate resources for the maintenance of the colony. So let's start here with the Cavite Mutiny. So on January 20, 1872, approximately 250 Filipino soldiers and workers rose in revolt at an arsenal in Cavite. 11 Spaniards were killed during the mutiny, but an immediate assault led by the government forces put an end to the uprising after 3 days. An oft-cited reason for the mutiny was a decree released by Governor General Rafael de Izquierdo. The decree ordered that the arsenal workers would no longer be exempted from the tributo and polo y servicio, a privilege they had enjoyed in the past. Official accounts, however, argue that the revolt was part of a larger movement with the aim of overthrowing the Spanish government and asserting independence. So, official reports also claim that the leaders of the mutiny had expected the support of close to 2,000 men from regiments. Based both in Cavite and in Manila, the plan was to begin the revolt after the midnight in Manila with rebels setting fires in Tondo to distract the authorities. A signal by way of fireworks would then be sent to the rebels in Cavite, who would then lay siege to the arsenal. In reality, however, the mutiny in Cavite began earlier in the evening, and many of those who pledged support defected and vowed loyalty to Spain. Ultimately, the mutiny failed, and the Spanish government used the incident as a means to suppress the increasing calls for a more liberal administration. Among those who clamored for reforms were Filipino secular priests. To understand how the Filipino secular priests became involved in the Cavite Mutiny of 1872, a brief historical background on the missionary efforts in the Philippines shall first be discussed. Secularization movement. The introduction and the strengthening of the Catholic faith were largely through the efforts of the two types of clergy, the regular priests and the secular priests. The regular clergy, whose jurisdiction fell on the elected prelates, were better prepared for their missionary work because of their standards of discipline and asceticism. Their job then was to introduce the faith, convert the natives, and establish religious communities. In the Philippines, 5 religious orders took on this task. The first one were the Augustinians, or the Order of St. Augustine, who arrived in 1565. No? The next one were the Discalced Franciscans, who arrived in 1578. The next to arrive were the Jesuits, founded by St. Ignatius of Loyola, who arrived in 1581. The next one were the Dominicans, or the Order of Preachers, who arrived in 1587. And the last one were the Augustinian Recollects, or the Order of Augustinian Recollects, OAR, who arrived in 1606. So the secular clergy, on the other hand, were priests who lived in the world. They were under the authority of bishops and not the members of a religious order. So they are the diocesan priests. So their primary task was the management of the religious communities, and ideally the continuation of the work already laid down by the regular clergy. In other words, while it was the task of a regular clergy to introduce the faith and establish the religious communities, the management of the parishes themselves was left to the secular priests. The missionary efforts in the Philippines, however, presented a unique case. In other Spanish colonies, a well-established parishes witnessed the replacement of a regular clergy by secular priests in the management of the religious communities. In the Philippines, the regular clergy remained administrators of the parishes well into the 19th century. So two issues were particularly contentious among the clergy in the Philippines. So these were there are two issues. No? The first issue had to do with episcopal visitations. An omnimoda bull passed by Pope Adrian VI in 1522 allowed the regulars to administer the sacraments and act as parish priests, independent from the authority of the local bishop. This bull, however, conflicted with reforms established in the Council of Trent, which declared that no priests could care for the souls of the laymen unless they were subjected to episcopal authority that often came in the form of visitations. Although King Philip II was granted discretionary power to enforce the reforms in the Philippines, the regular clergy often thwarted their implementation. So the regular clergy argued that if they allowed the visitations to occur, the congregation would be subjected to two sources of authority, the bishop and their provincial superiors, who may at some point issue conflicting orders. By refusing the episcopal visitations, they hope to avoid the possibility of violating their vows of obedience to their own superiors. Serious attempts to enforce the visitations, however, were often encountered by the regular clergy, who abused their authority by resigning from their posts and leaving their parishes unattended. This type of situation was especially disastrous in the early stages of Christianization, when the paucity of these secular priests often forced the government to give in to the wishes of the regular clergy. The second issue had to do with the management of the parishes. Regular priests maintained control over the parishes in the early stages of Christianization out of necessity, because of the scarcity of the secular priests to whom the parishes would be passed on. However, beginning the late 17th century, efforts were intensified to produce and train Filipino secular priests. that by 19th century they constituted an increasingly significant number. Despite this, the regular clergy usually contested, if not outright refused, the rights of the secular clergy to the parishes. Okay. One reason provided by the regulars was that the Philippines still remained an active mission en viva conquista espiritual, with some groups not yet Christianized. So they would therefore argue that the Filipinos were not ready to be turned over to the secular clergy. So another reason was more economic in nature, with the regulars refusing to give up the parishes that generated large profits for them. However, an overwhelming reason why the regulars refused to give up the parishes had to do with their view that the Filipino secular clergy were unqualified and incompetent. Even worse, some viewed the seculars as potential leaders of any future separatist movement. The secular clergy would react strongly to these claims. In the mid-19th century, Father Mariano Gomez, the parish priest of Bacoor, and Father Pedro Pelaez, secretary to the Archbishop, drew up expositions to the government on behalf of the secular clergy, but their efforts proved futile. The struggle eventually took on a different tone towards the 1860s, as the issue of secularization was no longer limited to questions of merit and competence. By 1864, the nature of the issue became one of racial equality as well. At the forefront of the struggle to gain equality between Spanish and Filipino priests was Father Jose Burgos. So the execution of Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora. So as the result of the revolt in Cavite, several priests and laymen were arrested on the orders of Governor General Rafael de Izquierdo. Among the priests arrested in the several succeeding days were Fathers Jose Burgos, Jacinto Zamora, Jose Guevara, Mariano Gomez, Feliciano Gomez, Mariano Sevilla, Bartolome Serra, Miguel de Laza, Justo Guazon, Vicente del Rosario, Pedro Dandan, and Anacleto Desiderio. Among the laymen were lawyers and businessmen like Gervasio Sanchez, Pedro Carrillo, Maximo Inocencio, Balbino Mauricio, Ramon Maurente, Maximo Paterno, and Jose Basa. These Filipinos were sentenced to varying terms of exile in Guam, while the three priests, Burgos, Gomez, and Zamora, on the other hand, were condemned to death by garrote on February 15, 1872. But actually, they were executed at Luneta, in Bagumbayan on February 17, 1872 in the morning. Okay, so a French writer-journalist in the name of Edmond Plauchot gave an account of the execution. So late in the night of 15th of February 1872, a Spanish court-martial found three secular priests, Burgos, Gomez, and Zamora, guilty of treason as the instigators of a mutiny in the Cavite Navy Yard a month before and sentenced them to death. The judgment of the court-martial was read to the priests in Fort Santiago early in the next morning, and they were told it would be executed the following day. Upon hearing the sentence, Burgos broke into sobs. Zamora lost his mind and never recovered, and only Gomez listened impassively, an old man accustomed to the thought of death. When dawn broke on 17th of February, There were almost 40,000 Filipinos who came from as far as Bulacan, Pampanga, Cavite, and Laguna. Surrounding the four platforms were the three priests and the man whose testimony had convicted them. A former artilleryman called Saldua would die. The three priests followed Saldua, Burgos weeping like a child, Zamora with vacant eyes, and Gomez head held high, no? Blessing the Filipinos who knelt at his feet, heads bared and praying. He was next to die when his confessor, a Recollect friar, exhorted him loudly to accept his fate. He replied, "Father, I know that not a leaf falls to the ground, but by the will of God, since He wills that I should die here, no? His holy will be done." Zamora went up a scaffold without a word and delivered his body to the executioner. His mind had already left it. Father Burgos was the last, a refinement of cruelty that compelled him to watch the death of his companions. He seated himself in the iron rest and then sprang up crying, "But what crime have I committed? Is it possible that I should die like this? My God, there's no justice on earth." Okay, so the dozen friars surrounded him, pressed him down again upon the seat of the garrote, pleaded with him to die a Christian death. He obeyed, but feeling his arms tied around the fatal post, protested once again, "But I am innocent." But one of the friars said, "So was Jesus Christ, no?" At this, Burgos resigned himself. So the executioner knelt at his feet and asked for his forgiveness. "I forgive you, my son. Do your duty." And it was done. Although the public execution of the three priests was meant to instill fear in the Filipinos, it had the opposite effect. In his work, the La Revolución Filipina, Apolinario Mabini stated, the friars wanted to make an example of Burgos and his companions so that the Filipinos should be afraid to go against them from then on. But that patent injustice, that official crime aroused not fear, but hatred of the friars and of the regime that supported them, and a profound sympathy and sorrow for the victims. This sorrow worked a miracle. It made the Filipinos realize their condition for the first time. Conscious of pain and thus conscious of life, they asked themselves what kind of life they lived. The awakening was painful, and working to stay alive more painful still, but one must live. How? They did not know, and the desire to know, the anxiety to learn, overwhelmed and took possession of the youth of the Philippines. The curtain of ignorance woven diligently for centuries was rent at last. Fiat lux, let there be light, would not be long in coming. The dawn of a new day was nearing. So in other words, that instead of instilling fear of the Philippines, the death of the three priests could serve as the inspiration of the Filipinos to work for the reforms in the Philippines, most especially no, against the hatred of the friars, no, the bigotry of the friars. So because of the death of the three priests, so it would awaken the nationalism of the Filipinos at that time, and one of them was Jose Rizal. So there will be no Jose Rizal without the death of those three priests. So that's all for our topic in Rizal. Thank you very much.